Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Becky Scherr.
And I'm Michael Brodkorb.
After a week off, today we are joined by Noem. This episode is just the two of us where we will break down our thoughts on the biggest news of the past week or so. We are going to start by breaking down the status of the Senator Mitchell arrest and this week's ethics hearing. Next, we will get into the controversy surrounding Governor Kristi Noem's recent oversharing and fallout from their announcement that former President Donald Trump will be coming to Minnesota on May 17th to headline the Republican Party of Minnesota's annual Lincoln Reagan dinner. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the show.
Becky, did you have a nice week off?
Had a great week off. We both had a little travels in the last week or so. We did an annual trip with my family to Florida. It was Wyatt's second time on an airplane. He was pretty much a rock star second time through. Thank goodness for naps, midday, and snacks, and iPads, and all of the wonderful, glorious things that keep a toddler happy. But the trip itself was great. He is fearless and wanting to jump in the pool and not have anybody catch him, despite his 2-year-old to wear a life jacket and not knowing how to swim at under 2 years old. But aside from a little added stress with that, it was awesome.
How was the weather?
So beautiful. It was 80 degrees the entire time. Great. We had a pool in the backyard of our Airbnb. Couldn't ask for anything more.
That's fantastic. You go down there roughly every year.
Yeah, no. So this is probably our 4th or 5th year. My parents rent an Airbnb. So it's my sister, her husband, 5-year-old twins, my brother, his girlfriend, me, my husband and son, and my parents all in one house. And we have a good time.
Sounds like the real world.
It is like the real world.
That was a good show.
Except for when we're not 7 strangers.
You're not 7 strangers. It's a great show. I remember that show. It was fantastic to watch. Having a little mic issue here, but we'll get through it.
We will get through it. You also had some recent travel.
Yes, I was in our nation's capital for a part of last week.
Beautiful with your family.
Yes, interest of kind of just explaining this. My son was out there for a field trip with his school, and then wife and I and our daughters went out there separately. And it was just a wonderful time of being in DC. Again, whole family was there, but we were there in separate capacities. And it was just an absolute gas. We were discussing this off air that my approach to DC.
Yes.
My approach to DC is like the little German kid in Willy Wonka in the Chocolate Factory.
Yes, Mr. Augustus.
Augustus Gloop. Yes. And so he is the kid that's putting his hands in the chocolate river.
Falls in.
I love DC. I love everything about DC. I've not worked out there extensively. You had the opportunity to work out there. When I was with my wife and daughters in the car, and I was explaining to them, this was my daughter's first trip to DC. And I explained to them that if I worked in DC, I would be on my 4th marriage. I'd probably be 400 pounds. I would be on my 5th or 6th heart attack. And I would probably be in some form of rehab
and smoking a pack a day. Those DCers, they love that.
Because it's just everything about DC. I'm literally a kid in the candy store. I just love everything about DC. I love the food. I love the buildings, the architecture, all of the history, the people, just everything about it. It's just the best way I can describe it. I would be like a kid in a candy store. So think of that little fat German kid in Willy Wonka in the Chocolate Factory who's got his hand in the chocolate river. That's me in DC. I would have a very difficult time focusing. It's such a beautiful city. It's such an amazing city. I'd like to spend a little time for a second just complimenting both elected officials in both parties. My son had the opportunity to meet with Senator Tina Smith, Senator Amy Klobuchar, and Congresswoman Angie Craig. Just a delightful opportunity for my son. And so I want to compliment the offices of Senator Tina Smith, Senator Klobuchar, and Representative Angie Craig. It was arranged through the school that my son went to. It was just a wonderful visit. And my son came back with just a renewed sense of appreciation of government. And it was a delight for him to meet elected officials and to meet both senators and Congresswoman Craig. We live in the 2nd Congressional District. His school's in the 2nd Congressional District. So that was the opportunity. So it was a little interesting. I worked on Mark Kennedy's race in 2006 when Amy Klobuchar was first elected to the United States Senate. I've run into her multiple times. She's been nothing but generous and kind to me. It was just interesting to see the picture of my son standing next to United States Senator Amy Klobuchar. It was just a delight. And he had such a wonderful time. And he was so excited to be in Washington and the experience that he had, and particularly the opportunity to meet with the elected officials was just wonderful.
I think that's one thing that a lot of people don't often, even if you're traveling to DC, don't take advantage of doing that outreach to the congressional delegation. They are very accessible for constituents in particular, but take partisan politics out of it. How incredible that your son at such a young age was able to meet with two US senators and a US congresswoman is just incredible, regardless of policy opinions and political party affiliation and all of that. That's just a really incredible thing to for him to be able to say and a memory for him to have.
They were delightful. I checked in. I didn't know until the last minute, and I didn't speak with Senator Klobuchar's office, but I had pinged with the members of Congress's offices through directly and then through a source just to let them know my son was going to be there and make sure he was on his best behavior because he is 50% of me. But they were just so kind. Their offices were just great. The members were wonderful, and it was just a great experience for my son and his classmates to be out there. So tip of the cap to our United States senators and Congresswoman Angie Craig's office. My wife and I and my daughters had an opportunity through Congressman Emmer's office to get a kind of a lay of the land and an opportunity just to see the trappings of Washington. And it was just a wonderful experience. As you pointed out, if you're Democrat or Republican, you should take advantage of reaching out to your member of Congress or someone that you know out there so you can just partake in just the trappings and the beauty and the grandeur of Washington, D.C. And Congressman Emmer's office was just delightful to my wife and to my family to give us a little bit of a tour. We got some floor passes to watch some of the congressional debate that was going on. And here was just somewhat of a personal story I'll share, but it was just remarkable. You would be surprised to learn that I'm not much of an athlete. Any athletic ability that my children have come from my wife. I have 4 sisters. All of my sisters are incredibly athletic, and would be a really good manager of a sports team. I'm really good at fantasy football, as Becky, of course.
Not your March Madness bracket.
But not
It's okay.
not March Madness. And so it was really interesting. And I've discussed this before on the podcast that my wife and I's approach to government with our kids is just to raise their civic IQ. We're not trying to indoctrinate them into a particular. We want them to have just a good understanding of how government works and let them go through their own journey of where they align on issues. I'm a resource to my kids when we talk about it, but we just have really try to just raise their civic IQ in discussions. It was just a wonderful moment to be in the House chamber, pointing out to my daughters, members of Congress that were there, and just see them just light up. And they're like, this is where I want to work. This is where I want to be. And it was just really fun to see that kind of creative and their interest in government and see it unfold there was such a treat. And I hope all families that go out there, Democrat, Republican, partake in that because it was just a wonderful family moment. And just huge kudos to Congressman Emmer and his staff for providing that opportunity for my family and for all the members of Congress that do that for people. I've just heard wonderful stories from my son's classmates and from other people about that. And you've shared some wonderful experiences too, where people do it. And so get to DC. It was the only downside about DC. It's built on a swamp and I do not react good to heat. And so it was really hot. It was really hot out there, but we did just a lot of wonderful stuff. Nighttime tours. We went to Arlington Cemetery, just a number of just wonderful things that we were able to do. And I can't recommend DC more, and I cannot wait to go back.
What is your favorite, along the mall adjacent, favorite memorial monument thing to look at?
I'm a big fan of the EPA building. I'm just joking. No, I'm just
so thrown off by that.
No, I'm a big fan of the Lincoln Memorial. I like the Lincoln Memorial. I did. And one thing we did this time I had not done before, and I've been on DC multiple times, was go at night. To see them at night was just remarkable. It was also cool. First night I was out there, the White House Correspondents' Dinner was going on. I did not bring a tuxedo with, so I couldn't get in. But we were doing a tour of DC at night, and President Biden came back to the White House, and there was a huge motorcade, just all that type of stuff. My son was at Mount Vernon. He saw a Marine One, and I had explained to my kids without getting into without breaking a security issue, like how the helicopters ride and to watch out for them. So my son got a picture of the white tops over the Potomac by Mount Vernon and stuff. So it was just great. I just love everything about it. But I would say my favorite is probably the Lincoln. And we went there at night and it was just gorgeous. How about you?
Jefferson's my favorite.
Yeah.
It's a little off the beaten path, so you got to make the extra effort to go over there. But now you got the three eras of FDR. You got MLKJ over there, so definitely worth a little off the beaten path. And I just have a fun fact here. When I worked on the Romney 2012 campaign, obviously it's different than a presidential motorcade, but we had Paul Ryan, who at that time was the vice president nominee with Romney, that would come in Wisconsin, and as staff, we had to participate in the motorcade sometimes. And I drove a press van in VP candidate Ryan's motorcade one time.
That is fantastic.
Yeah, I got yelled at by Secret Service. I wasn't keeping up too well.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I could not, by the way, just a reference to the EPA. We did walk past the EPA building. I had my kids take a picture because of who founded the EPA. Richard Nixon. So I made a point to say, look at Nixon. I
thought Republicans hated the environment.
Yes, Nixon started. I also made a point to see the Watergate Hotel, which is just a great part of American history. Just everything in D.C. And that's, again, if you know me, I'm a political junkie. It's just think of that little fat German sticking his hand in the chocolate river, and that would be me in D.C.
I love it. Speaking of very powerful scenarios and situations going on right now, there was a holiday this week. Did you celebrate?
Oh my goodness gracious. I celebrate this holiday religiously. Tell me about how you celebrated May the 4th be with you, which is colloquially known as Star Wars Days.
Yeah, I got nothing.
You didn't celebrate it?
I didn't celebrate.
I bet you're a Star Trek person, aren't you?
Obviously.
Gee, come on.
Is that right?
She's doing the live long and prosper Spock sign right now. I will explain something to my kids. Star Wars happened a long time ago in a galaxy far away. So it's very likely happened. Star Trek is in the future, so it hasn't happened. So a couple things. We've made one Star Wars reference in a show previously.
Yes, of whether you were breaking the law.
Yes, and I'm not.
Right,
I'm not.
correct.
I gifted you an article from the New York Times.
You are well within your rights, and thank God for you and others for keeping it all going. Bravo.
Yes, I celebrated May the 4th. I watched all the Star Wars films, the way they were meant to be. I watched those and had some blue milk. Chems came out with blue milk, so I had a bunch of blue milk, which wasn't as good as I thought. It was a vanilla flavor kind of thing, but it was blue, it was thick. I did that. And then I updated my Apple Watch with the targeting computer of the T-65 X-Wing starfighter that Luke Skywalker flies. That's the targeting computer when he's going down the shaft to blow up the Death Star. Not to ruin the movie for you.
I didn't know we could nerd out a little bit more than all of our fascination with Washington, D.C. and stuff. But you took us over.
I think it's a good look. That's a really good look.
It does look great.
So that's the targeting computer, and it doesn't match up, doesn't move like it did in the movie.
It looks like from Entrapment with Catherine Zeta-Jonas going over the lasers in that.
Yep.
That's what it looks like to me.
No, it was great. One other thing I will point out, Star Wars related. I was in the Smithsonian, and I'm in the Smithsonian American history portion of the Smithsonian. Interesting little side note. My son, there was a R2-D2 and C-3PO who are in Star Wars are behind glass there. My son sent me a picture and said, hey, it's the droids from Star Trek, just to get under my skin. I'm watching the film that they're showing in the National Smithsonian, and they show a clip from Star Wars. And the clip from Star Wars they show, damn it, is from the George Lucas special edition version when the Death Star blows up, and it's the added ring. And I literally turn to someone because anytime I hear Star Wars sounds or anything, I just freeze and turn into a 13-year-old watching the screen. I'm standing there with all these kids, and the explosion of the Death Star happens. And I said, that's the wrong one. And no one was willing to join me in protest. But Star Wars is something is just a part of my life, and I appreciate you allowing me to nerd out. And I hope over the course of this podcast that your family will start doing your duty and supporting the Star Wars franchise more. I'd be happy if you'd like to invite your entire family over for 9 to 12 hours. We can watch all the films, and I can do just a brief 9 to 12 hours. I got some blue milk for your son.
Yeah.
I'll serve some other type of Star Wars related food, and we'll walk you through all of them.
We'll make it happen. Can I nerd out one more time though, and real quick?
Yes.
Say fantastic history about the Smithsonian's, that Mr. Smithson, who gave the money to start that, had offered it to the English government, and they said no thank you. And so he had never even been in the United States, but was a fan of George Washington and bequeathed all this money to the United States to start this free education museums for educating the public. Thank you for bowing out.
That's
England.
Great. That's right. You have shared a couple of tidbits, which I don't want to spoil. But if we ever do a podcast in DC, You should be leading that in just like a walking tour because you had some great tidbits.
I've really been lucky. I think anytime you can go on a guided tour, I was telling you, next time you got to do the Segway. My mom wanted to do it when my siblings and her came out very shortly after I moved to DC. And I was like mortified. Like, oh my God, I just moved here and my friends out here and coworkers are going to see me on a freaking Segway on Constitution. It is the best way to find out little random fun facts that you would never find out if you're just the beauty of walking. Go for it. Just walk. It's free. That's wonderful. But if you have the ability to do any of this, especially when you can contact your members of Congress and get some of these things for free, tours of the Pentagon, Arlington, Congress, Library of Congress, all of that, do it. The fun facts are galore.
I have one food related moment from the DC trip I need to
Yeah.
disclose. Someone who has trolled us extensively on
Mhm.
social media, Melanie Myers, with related to our food takes. She
Yes.
really redeemed herself. She is known, I think, professionally on social media as having some of the worst food takes I've ever.
She loves ham. We gotta
They're
love
just
her.
terrible. So I gave her a redemption opportunity. I'm in DC and I sent her a note at DM asking for her if give me her best pizza take. And she recommended Manny and Olga's and it was just absolutely fantastic. And I even when I sent her DM, I said, "A lot is riding on your picks for pizza. This is your chance to redeem yourself." And then after I said, "You nailed it. It was an absolutely wonderful pizza. This isn't a paid advertisement, but it was great pizza. If you're in DC, I would encourage you to follow Melanie for any food related suggestions. And then I can give 2 thumbs up to Manny and Olga's Pizza, which was a late night delivery. Could not have been better. Perfect choice. Loved it. Melanie, you totally redeemed yourself."
Fantastic. A good little recap of why we were away and took a little bit of time off. But now let's get into it. While I was gone, y'all did I just turned Texan for a little bit, y'all.
Yes.
Covered a little bit of the status update of the Senator Mitchell arrest and subsequent follow. This week was the Ethics Committee hearing, so there's a lot of different things at play. But I think to try to narrow things down a little bit, we're gonna just focus on this ethics hearing that at the time of this filming was less than 24 hours ago, and it was an interesting thing to watch. Initial thoughts.
First of all, we normally release episodes on Tuesdays. We delayed the recording of this, and our intention was to record it after the ethics hearing. It went very long into the night, and I just want to point out something. As I was watching it, I'm like, we got to record right away. Then I realized how late it was, and I'm like, there's no way I can stay awake. And I just want to compliment you for once again providing a bit of clear direction and just knowing that we're where we are in our lives, that it would have taken a lot of caffeine for us to stay up late
I
and
need
do
a
it.
post 3 p.m. coffee to
Yes.
stay up beyond
There was no way I
9:30.
could have done it. And so we're recording this the next day. It was, I would say, so this is Wednesday, day after. The farther I get away from that hearing, the more I think historical and ridiculous it was. And first of all, let me just say at the onset, because I think that the Senate Republicans did an astounding job. I think the presentation by Senator Housley, Senator Lucero on the ethics matter related to Senator Mitchell was precise, direct, overwhelming. I think that the cadence that they worked out on the presentation, how they presented, how they discussed it, I thought they did a great job. I also want to compliment Senator Matthews and Senator Miller. They're two Republican members of the Ethics Committee, and it may be surprising to some of our listeners. I'm gonna take a very partisan edge, but I think it's along not just a partisan edge, but also just a sense of right and wrong edge in this particular matter. As people know, I've been highly critical of Republicans and Democrats, and I also want to compliment when there's opportunities. I think that the Senate Republicans did a remarkable job in terms of being good stewards of defending the institution of the Senate, presenting, I think, a very credible case, of an overwhelmingly credible case that Senator Mitchell had violated the ethics and standings and rules of the Senate. And I think they were met with a level of gamesmanship and BS that I think was just very disappointing. But I want to get your take too.
Yeah, just at the table a little bit. I think it's important to remember that this is not addressing whether she was guilty or not guilty. This is not trying to get into the criminal complaint at all. It is solely looking at the ethics and the upholding of what the Senate institution stands for. And so part of Senator Eric Lucero's closing statement says, "It's never easy to stand in judgment of a colleague. However, our responsibility requires us to make difficult decisions. We're not asking you to serve as a court of law. We are asking you to uphold the integrity of this institution and restore public trust." And again, this is really whether this conduct was becoming of a senator, whether that this is something who folks who are supposed to be held to a higher standard and be trusted and regarded and all of the above as a member, as an elected official, a member of our Minnesota legislature. And it's just been 2 weeks of distraction, 2 weeks of chaos, 2 weeks of all of this because of her conduct. So again, guilty or not guilty, we've gone through many times when there have been here in Minnesota, when Minnesota electeds at all levels have resigned under allegations, true or untrue. We have Senator Franken, we have Dan Schoen, we have Tony Cornish, we have all of these other examples of this. So this is not anything completely new to this. I agree. I think that the Republicans, I think Lucero and House, they did a really good job of trying to reiterate that, despite the defense counsel and Democrats trying to circle back to the criminal case. Miller and Myers did, or I'm sorry, Andrew Matthews did a
Senator
really good
Matthews, yep.
job in their circular. My biggest frustration, and maybe if we're ready to get into it, the chair of the committee, Senator Bobby Joe Champion, I thought was really out of line in his questioning of this. So I had this playing in my house through dinner and the evening, and so my husband is not politically involved at all. And he was questioning. I'd explained to him that there's two Republicans and two Democrats, and this is supposed to be like the ultimate nonpartisan kind of scenario, right? Obviously, there's partisanship and everything, but it's meant to be that. And I was really taken aback with how Senator Bobby Joe Champion obviously is a defense attorney, and he, I think, had a hard time drawing that line between chair of this committee and playing that role.
I would absolutely agree with you. I have not articulated, I think, enough my little history with Senator Bobby Joe Champion, in the sense that I covered a case when I was doing some writing for the Star Tribune involving the case of a couple kids that disappeared from Lakeville. And that also involved some issues related to Michelle McDonald and her law license. Michelle McDonald's law license is currently still suspended. She was a candidate for the Minnesota Supreme Court multiple times, but she had engaged in a number of issues of ethical violations and rules governing licensed attorneys. The Office of Lawyers' Professional Responsibility has filed multiple petitions against Michelle McDonald, and in one of the most recent disciplinary hearings that were in front of the Supreme Court, Bobby Joe Champion defended Michelle McDonald. Let me just state unequivocally that people are entitled to have a defense. They are entitled to have a defense attorney and all that type of stuff. That doesn't remove my ability to be critical of it. I think Bobby Joe Champion presenting himself as the chair of the ethics committee, as the president of the Senate, I think it is absolutely preposterous that a defense attorney who wanted Michelle McDonald to keep her law license has been elevated to a leadership position in the Minnesota Senate where he's going to call balls and strikes on matters related to ethics. That's a direct and fair criticism of Bobby Joe Champion. And I think what the public saw last night in, I think, a larger scale was the level of hackery that Senator Bobby Joe Champion is absolutely willing to engage in. And I think he was exposed last night because I've seen some of that hackery. I saw him as a defense attorney in the Minnesota Supreme Court arguing that Michelle McDonald should be able to keep her law license. And this is a lawyer who to this day is still suspended by the Minnesota, who's still unable to practice law and likely will stay that way for a very long time. Again, just to say to our listeners one more time, Google Michelle McDonald and you'll learn a lot. But just remember that the person who was chairing the ethics committee and who presides as an umpire of the Minnesota Senate and calls balls and strikes on things being fair or unfair is Bobby Joe Champion, who wanted her to keep her law license. And so what I saw last night was what I've seen before from Bobby Joe Champion. I thought he was out of line. I thought he was not acting in his role as the chair of the ethics committee, but he was acting as a member of Senator Mitchell's defense team, and he should have been testifying at the table, not leading the committee. I thought it was obnoxious, and I do hope, and I wrote this and discussed this, which is I feel that I hope that his role and the lens in which people have judged him certainly changes, because I have not had any desire to go out and constantly remind people, but it's I was what I saw in Bobby Joe Champion last night was stuff I've seen before, and I've always cringed a little bit when he ever puts on his legal hat, and when I see him in the Senate. In that kind of leadership capacity of calling balls and strikes on ethics and what's inbounds and what's out, I don't consider Bobby Joe Champion to be a credible source.
I completely agree. And it's one of those situations where I didn't have a lot of faith that the ethics committee was going to take any action against Senator Mitchell going into this. I think that he could have remained a relatively neutral arbitrator of this situation, having some questions and not stepped into that role, and it would have had the same outcome at the end of the hearing of pushing it beyond criminal, well, which we'll get into. But I want to chat about some of the notes that I took while listening to this. Senator Miller was going through kind of some of the things in the criminal complaint, asking when it was time to ask some questions to Senator Mitchell did not speak herself. She was sitting at the table, never seen, let's come back to, but her defense attorney answered all questions. So Senator Miller, Republican, was asking questions about some of the things in the criminal complaint. Every time the defense attorney was saying, Senator Mitchell pleads the fifth or is using her Fifth Amendment rights. And at one point, Senator Champion stepped in and said something of, are you going to go through are you going to make us stand here and go through all of this while she's pleading as a standing blanketed statement about her Fifth Amendment rights? And it was one of those, like, we don't know that it's up to her to invoke the fifth on every question, right? Yes, sure, you could have a standing Fifth Amendment, but he answered some questions.
Correct.
So Senator Miller was doing his due diligence of continuing to ask questions, understanding that majority of them would likely be rebuffed by the defense counsel, but some might get answered.
Correct.
And so that was just one that really gave me some pause. Senator Housley asked a question about the caucus, right? The caucus has removed you from committees, has removed you from caucus meetings. Has anybody asked you to resign? And Senator Champion very strongly stepped in at this point and said, out of bounds. That's not out of bounds. Did you think that was out of bounds? Because
No.
my take of that is that she's essentially asking, without saying the words, does the Senate DFL caucus think that she violated ethical conduct of the Senate? If they asked you to resign, that's understanding they think that you probably were in violation here. I didn't think it was out of bounds at all.
It was not out of bounds. And we should note that you did attend a year of law school, and you are the legal analyst. You are the
No.
legal analyst and advisor to the breakdown. So, yes, so I'm going to defer to you on all legal questions. Yes, but I think it was out of line. And it's an example of where I think
Do you think it was out of line or not out of line?
I do not believe it. I believe
No.
that Senator Champion stopping those
Right.
questioning was wrong.
Yes.
And I think he was wrong. I think he was trying to do cleanup. And at some point, I think he should have just sat at the defense table.
Right.
Because he was shielding questions. And I think again, I'm not surprised, but I guess I am surprised how just naked the raw politics was at that hearing, the
Right.
intellectual dishonesty that was occurring in that room by particularly, and I want to be very clear, by the DFL members. And I have tried to strike a more conciliatory tone, and we do particularly do on this podcast. It was very difficult for me to watch that proceeding last night and not come away saying that the Republicans acted. If we were going to assign virtue and vice to some people, I think the Republicans in the ethics committee did a fantastic job of conveying to the public what needed to be done. It is all, of course, palace intrigue. But I think that they had the intellectually consistent position. I think they articulated it well. I think, again, Senator Lucero, Senator Housley, I don't know who made that choice to have them do it, but I think they did a fantastic job. They had their remarks prepared. They was perfectly timed. They were articulate. They were clear. They were precise. Here's one of the biggest BS moments I want to call out is when Senator Housley started speaking and Bobby Joe Champion tried to ding her bring her up related to a matter on Facebook and some other types of stuff. He pounced on he verbally pounced on Senator Housley very quickly.
Have you never been misquoted by the press?
And there were a number of times in the hearing where Bobby Joe Champion had to, I think, he was either getting updates from someone because pretty clearly a narrative started to develop that he'd taken some swipes at the media about being inaccurately quoted. A reporter with the Star Tribune, there was an allegation, I think, made. I want to be precise that Senator Champion was alluding to the fact that someone may have been misquoted or something like that and threw the media under the bus. Senator Champion last night contorted himself and stretched as far as he could to throw every conceivable defense for Senator Mitchell into that arena to cast doubt. And then simultaneously, as his role as a chair, impeded Senator Miller and Senator Matthews from offering positions. And I thought it was incredibly inappropriate. And I do believe that he acted as a defense attorney. He was digging into that. He commandeered very inappropriately the flow of that hearing. Mm-hmm. And I think Senator Housley, Senator Lucero did a great job of not accepting, in some instances, the premise of what they were trying to do. I also have to just say in very clear language, I don't know how they did it. I got to tell you something. The manner in which Senator Lucero, particularly Senator Housley, certainly Senator Miller, and I guarantee you Senator Matthews were spoken to, I don't know how they didn't get up and walk out. They are more patient and disciplined than I am, but every one of them was treated rude.
Yep.
And I don't know that I can necessarily rank them, but I will certainly say that Senator Housley was treated in an incredibly disrespectful manner. I thought Senator Champion talked down to Senator Miller and to Senator Matthews. And let me just be clear. There's 67 members. They all got the election certificates. And the level of just, I think, I don't want to cast an entire dispersion on the legal profession. But Senator Bobby Joe Champion did not act, I think, in his capacity as a senator last night. I think he acted as a defense attorney more than that. And I think he was disrespectful to all the members, particularly the Republican members of the committee. And I hope that the Republicans re-examine how they view Senator Champion, because how he acted, I think, there's a real trajectory issue, which we can get in, as to how the Senate goes forward. But that's the type of position that you need, is someone who can be even keel, who can call balls and strikes fairly. I get it's a partisan environment, but there was, I think, a rushed approach that he was taking to just speed through stuff, and he wanted to shut it down. And I think it's unfortunate because intellectually and honestly, I am not saying this to the degree which I identify as a Republican. There's no question that the Republican position was more sound, more based in logic, reason, and fact. And what I think prevented that from getting out was the raw partisanship of the Democrats and someone else that we're going to talk about here soon.
Yeah, absolutely. And a couple of things that I wanted to as a follow-up from what you were saying is, as Senator and Chair Champion had blocked Housley's question, Senator Matthews, again, Republican side, stepped up and said, because there was Senator Glenn Gruenhagen had his portion of the committee hearing prior. It was 2 hours. It was long. It was drawn out. And pretty much everything was on the table for that. Senator Matthews, when this question was being shot down by Senator Champion, said basically, we just had a committee hearing and nothing was off the table. You allowed every question, regardless of, it's not the Senate floor where you can call into question of the germaneness and all of that, right? It's up to the testifier, to the defense, to Senator Mitchell and her attorney, whether they want to answer these questions or plead the fifth or not answer them, or however they want to go about that. And I thought that Senator Matthews is my age, maybe a little younger. The gumption that it takes to stand up to a senior member of the majority who's the chair, the president, and to go about it in that way, I thought was very respectful. It was an agree to disagree kind of moment, but he was pushing back on this. You don't just get to say what questions are acceptable or not. This is just not it. I really appreciated that. One thing I did want to bring up, you mentioned the member of the press who was in question of some statements and whether they were factual or not. So Ryan Faircloth, a member of a reporter for the Star Tribune, tweeted last night about this situation, and I'm not saying that this obviously is not going to come into play with the ethics hearing. It was going on. It's not like they're going to be like, oh, member of the press says we have the audio. Let's play that. But like you've done interviews with elected officials, most members of the press and staffers record these interactions and how they have something to go back on. And it was the situation in play here was Ringstrom, who was, I believe it was the father of the defense attorney. So at the same firm, Senator Mitchell's firm, said immediately after the arrest, I believe she was trying to protect herself from being noticed. I am not going to deny that. She basically wanted to make a check and retrieve a couple of items that she felt were wrongfully withheld from her despite earlier promises. So this is the comment that Champion was trying to discredit and say members of the press get it wrong all the time. People are misquoted on all the time. Whereas the Republican side was trying to say the own firm that she's defending said she was there, she broke in, she was trying to take things. The whole thing was the tit for tat of all of these statements and all of that. And this reporter has since said it has been cited repeatedly. The president has cast a doubt on it. I have it on tape and I'm happy to let it listen to it. Stands behind it. I just want to throw it out there because it wasn't BS. It is what it is. And a good thing that they were pushing of why she should be removed because she made comments contrary to the truth.
Correct.
And that is the big thing when we're looking at these ethics of whether she uphold this, whether she was actually doing this, and the mockery she's basically made of her position and the Senate.
Correct. And I will say to you that what you've articulated and what you've presented there is just another example of what Bobby Joe Champion was doing. Aside from slowing members and breaking their cadence to ask questions, allowing there to be the consistent rope and latitude that was provided in the first ethics hearing, Senator Champion certainly presented a very short, a very limited amount of window and latitude that the Republican members of the committee had to answer questions. And I would say to you the fact, once again, that one of his first things he did was launch into Senator Housley, I thought was incredibly inappropriate in terms of managing the committee. And again, I believe that partisanship, there's benefits sometimes to partisanship. And what I'm just disappointed in is, and I want to be consistent, is I think that the Republicans had a very clear and consistent, articulate position of what had been done. And I think the most challenging interruption to that hearing was Senator Mitchell's attorney, who I think fundamentally changed the dynamics of the hearing. And the only type of minor criticism I think I have of the Republicans, and this is minor, kind of a game day thing, is he was doing, I don't know if something could have been done procedurally I don't think it was, and I don't want to Monday morning quarterback it too much, but his introduction was so disruptive, I think, to the overall proceedings. Again, this is the institution of the Senate. This is not a court of law. And I understand that we could dedicate hours of a podcast discussing the intricacies, but the fact that he elevated himself to what he did and his accusatory tone and the manner in which he's described. Now, I made the point on social media last night that if we're looking at this just from the standpoint of Senator Mitchell, he accomplished what he needed to accomplish.
Absolutely.
Here's what happened last night. The Ethics Committee deadlocked at a very quick pace thanks to Senator Champion. They're going to meet in a couple of weeks. Right. She is likely, I think, has more of an opportunity now, I think, to be the 34th vote to get what the Democrats' agenda that they want passed. And so he was able, I think, if you're talking about that role of an attorney and your job is to zealously advocate for your client, he was there in his capacity to zealously advocate for Senator Mitchell. He was a shield. He blocked her from verbalize that he was blocking her from testifying. He went, I think, in a very disrespectful way, spoke down to and tried to should be examined, because I got to tell you, it's not a court of law. The Senate gets to enforce their rules. And I think if his job was to disrupt that proceeding, he did a good job of disrupting the proceeding. The only thing I would say is, was there an opportunity to do anything to calibrate on that? But overall, I stand by my position is that the Senate Republicans, all members of the Senate committee on the Mitchell complaint, did an absolutely fantastic job. They presented a very clear argument as to why she should leave. I understand the argument about the legal proceeding, but again, you can't have it both ways. And ultimately, what we could have here is we're in this type of this could be solved very easily. The institution of the Senate could examine their rules to allow for these types of situations to happen in the future. The truth of the matter is this: the Senate Democrats are allowing this in part because they need her for the 34th vote. What I think is likely going to happen is that now that this ethics committee matter is met, Senator Mitchell is going to be the 34th vote. They're going to pass the agenda that they want. And at some point, possibly in the near future, depending on the outcome of her criminal trial, she might resign and she might not be a state senator anymore. And again, I go back to what you raised and what Senator Housley dialed into so perfectly, which was this: the Senate Democrats have already made a determination in some way that Senator Mitchell's conduct warrants discipline, that it warrants discipline. So they're not consistent on the discipline front. The Senate Democrats accept the premise in leadership that her conduct of what she's just been charged with and what's being discussed warrants her role as an elected official to be limited in certain ways. What they're not doing is they're not taking away her vote. For what reason? Because they need her vote. They need her 34th vote. And so I think the Senate Republicans did a fantastic job last night. I think her lawyer successfully shielded his client in an obnoxious, flamboyant way. And I think it's going to lead the scenario that I think it'd be very curious is what happens in the following weeks and the following remaining days of session. As I said in my post last night, I'll be very curious how the Senate Republicans react to this. I just have to say again, I don't know how Senator Lucero, Senator Housley, Senator Miller, and Senator Matthews they should be giving TED Talks on patience and turning the other cheek, because there were multiple incidents where they were just treated in an absolutely condescending and disrespectful way. And they kept focused on the mission and what they did. And they did a fantastic, I don't know how they did it, but they should be applauded for sticking to their roles as elected officials, honoring the institution of the Senate by proceeding with their case, and not allowing themselves to succumb to, I think, antagonistic, out of line questioning and bullying by a lawyer there to defend his client and the chair of the ethics committee, who I think was acting inappropriately.
So, if you haven't watched, I highly encourage you to go watch. Michael tweeted the link out. We'll put it in the show notes. Republican side starts about an hour 55 in, defense about 2:42 in. But one of you really hit the nail on the head, because one of the biggest frustrations I had while watching this is the legislature is big on decorum and big on the traditions and niceties that kind of go along with it, right? Like you direct your questions to the chair, all of these different things. And the tone and tenor of which the defense attorney was using, and the way he was questioning and directly questioning Housley and Lucero, not going through the chair, and then it was never stopped in the cross examinations. It was just too far and too much. And that was a really big frustration, because this is supposed to be the ethics hearing where we are really supposed to be minding our P's and Q's and having this civil conversation about whether the ethics of the Senate were violated. We're not talking about whether she's guilty or not. We're not talking about whether she actually stole the laptop and actually stole her dead father's ashes and all of these specifics of the case. We're talking about, as a senator, is she casting doubt and bringing shame essentially to the Senate? Did she violate these rules of what a senator is supposed to be doing? And her defense attorney, you're right, he did exactly what he was hired there to do, especially because there was no pushback from the chair on this. And it was really hard to watch and really unfortunate, because I do think, like you mentioned, it could change the trajectory of what this kind of system and how things are going about, because it was just allowed and it was fine and it was good. So why is anybody supposed to act any differently in the future?
Correct. And I think that there was more deference given to I think the person in the ethics committee last night that got the most deference was Senator Mitchell's attorney. It was not the members of it was
No
not.
one who has an actual election certificate.
And I mean, I think we're both rational and reasonable at this, that this was not a courtroom. This was a legislative hearing. And this is, there were 67. This was a legislative hearing. A Senator Champion, I think, inconsistently and through a lens of partisanship, showed tremendous deference to Senator Mitchell's attorney at the expense of his Republican colleagues and them exercising their rights as elected members of the Senate to police and attempt to enforce the rules of the Senate. And there are just some certain things that as senators they get to do that the average person doesn't. And that's just the way it is. They're members of the legislature. They have election certificates. And I do hope that and this is putting on even more of a partisan hat right now. I just will say it. I think Senator Champions should, his role as the ethics chair, his role as the president of the Senate should be completely reexamined as to how it's viewed through that lens. Because I think that there was just raw, naked partisanship last night. And I get the lawyers out there on Twitter are saying this, but the truth of the matter is this, is that the Senate Democrats have made a decision to discipline Senator Mitchell based on what's in the report, what's been discussed publicly. And to think, and so if I'm understanding Senator Champion's position, and please, again, as the legal advisor to the podcast, please tell me if I'm wrong. His position is that basically none of this information can exist. We don't know the validity or the veracity of anything that's being discussed. Yet his own caucus has made a determination that Senator Mitchell should be disciplined in some way. And it's such an inconsistent argument. And I know it's politics and it's gamesmanship and it happens on both sides. I'm not naive, but I guess I'm just getting a little older and I guess I'm more comfortable calling it out and saying, can't we do a better job? And I think that there was a real opportunity for that. And those that have listened to this podcast know that I'm critical of Republicans and sometimes more than Democrats. I think, again, just to say it one last time, Senator Lucero, Senator Housley, Senator Miller, and Senator Matthews did an absolutely fantastic job. I am so impressed by their candor, their temperament, their judgment, how they articulated their points. They were good stewards. They were without a doubt more responsible members of the ethics committee than anyone else in the room. They were the only adults. And my only hope, and I can say this without any hesitation, my only hope is that there are consequences for how the four of them were treated in that room last night. I hope that there are consequences for how they were treated, because they were treated in a disrespectful, condescending manner by members of the ethics committee and by a lawyer in the room. And I hope there are consequences because they deserved better.
And they reacted in ways that really need to be applauded, like you mentioned. It is just really to be able to take that on the chin and still be respectful to the others in the room. The respect that they gave back that they were not receiving is truly compelling. I want to veer into a tweet message, a tweet that you tweet message. I sound old as
What do you
chaos. You put out one yesterday talking about the potential implications that this hearing is going to have on the presidential race. It was a great chain that you put out. I retweeted it, and I think we need to chat through a little bit of it. But it came into play right away. So Mitchell's defense attorney comes up. So your comments here, and I'll let you get into your side of this, but was essentially talking about how the Senate DFL keeping Mitchell in, I'm going to just read it, keeping Senator Nicole Mitchell as their 34th vote. It will significantly undermine the moral high ground Minnesota Democrats have built up among swing voters. Former President Senate DFL is essentially trading what has been a winning message against former President Donald Trump and about his criminal and legal issues by Minnesota Democrats to pass their legislative agenda. I thought it was a great take, and I was excited to talk about it. Even more because after his ridiculous questioning of Lucero and Housley, Ringstrom, the Mitchell's attorney, in his opening statement, mentioned once about the right of due process, whether you're downtown Manhattan or here in St. Paul. Obviously a veiled reference to the legal proceedings going on in Manhattan against former Senator Trump. So if you want to share a little bit about your take on this, because I think it was just spot on and will be very telling of how it plays into what the Democrats are trying to do here in Minnesota.
I appreciate the intro on this. And this is what I would say. So again, what's the argument that Democrats and a lot of Republicans have made, including me,
Mhm.
is that Donald Trump is somewhat compromised because of the legal position that he's in. He's going to be a distraction. He's got these legal cases. He's off the campaign trail. He's embroiled in a number of these issues. And Democrats have been really, particularly in Minnesota and nationally, making the case that he's unqualified because of things that he's done. And there is an ethical standard that we should expect out of leaders. Okay, let's talk about that for a second. I completely agree with that
Mhm.
message. I did not support Trump in 16 or 20. I didn't vote for him. I voted for Nikki Haley. I'm not going to be voting for Trump this time. So let's set that aside. Now we have a situation where the Democrats have a member of their caucus who has been credibly accused, and I'm using that word specifically, credibly accused and charged with a felony for burglary. And they are turning, in essence, a blind eye and allowing her to participate in the legislative process and be the 34th vote to pass their agenda. That has tremendous ramifications. And here's why it has even more ramifications than when I originally thought about it. Guess who's coming to town? President Trump is coming to town.
Yes, he is.
And I can totally see President Trump getting that narrative and getting that message. And I think it's something that I think it's an absolutely fair point because I have said this, I've made this point. My concern about Donald Trump is some of these legal issues. I do think he's a distraction. I do think that there can be a due process while simultaneously it's a complication to serving and running an office. That's the position I staked out.
Mhm.
I believe that Senator Mitchell should be given complete due process, but there's a due process in the court and there's a due process in the Senate.
Correct.
And with the Senate Democrats, let's be clear about something. Do you know who the first people were to punish Senator Mitchell? The Senate Democrats were.
Yes.
It wasn't anything that the Republicans did. The first consequences that Senator Mitchell has was about this particular matter. They removed her from committees. They apparently, in some contexts, may have removed her from some caucuses.
Mhm.
So she has a limited capacity as a senator right now because Senate Democrats led in it. But then they're simultaneously allowing her to be the 34th vote.
Right.
And I think that the truth of the matter is that Donald Trump is coming to Minnesota, and the internet's on the computer. It's conceivable, absolutely conceivable, that former President Trump, when he's here, ties his legal case to what Democrats are doing, and there's a national target or bullseye put on Minnesota. In particularly, there's a messaging nexus that occurs between the Trump campaign and what Democrats are doing here, the Senate Democrats are doing here. Minnesota is becoming, based on polling, becoming more and more of at least an opportunity where both sides are going to have to invest in some resources here. I still think that this is a tough state for Republicans to win, but President Trump is coming here. And the truth of the matter is that he has shown an ability rhetorically to banter and get it and to want to scrap this stuff up. And I think the Senate Democrats are serving it up to President Trump and his campaign.
Mhm.
That message conflicts with what national Democrats are saying and Minnesota Democrats are saying. And I think the Senate DFL, and I'll say this, I think Ken Martin is hands down one of the best party chairmen that's ever had on both sides of the aisle.
Mhm.
He has called for Senator Mitchell that he would, if it was her, he would consider, I think I want to be very careful with my remarks.
He said
If you have
he
it there.
would like Senator Mitchell to resign post-session, but by June 8th, which I believe is filing deadline, so her seat could be filled by a special election in November.
Okay, so he's halfway there in a sense. So
Right.
he still wants the 34 vote, but here's the issue. I think last night was a game changer
Mhm.
in that message. And I'd put that out prior to the hearing, but the Democrats jumped all in. And I can absolutely, just to finish the point, see a situation when the president comes to town, that there's a reference point and a kind of a messaging nexus where he says, and I threw out a little narrative of what he could potentially
Yeah,
say.
do you have a good Trump
I don't.
impersonation?
I don't. My son has a really good Trump perspective, but no. And my message was basically, and this is my best, I wrote this in.
Yes, hear it in your best Trump voice.
They're prosecuting me across the country for made up crimes while this woman dressed like a cat burglar broke into her stepmother's bedroom, crawled across the floor to sneak up on her, and Minnesota Democrats are using her vote to change election laws. Talk about elections being stolen, and the media won't report on it.
It means spot on.
I could absolutely see him saying something along those lines. And I
And
try to,
being valid.
and yes, and I'm trying to be intellectually consistent. The person who's saying this, I am not voting for Trump. I didn't vote for him in 1620. There's reams and reams of audio tapes of us talking about
Right.
this. This is where I think the intellectual consistency point, and this is where I think this could really blow up for Senate Democrats.
And it would, I mean, truly be a missed opportunity if Trump didn't go there, because it really does. For anybody watching who might think that the Senate Democrats or Democrats in this legislature have the moral high ground, might tamp that down a little bit. Because again, as you mentioned, the Senate Democrats were the first one to take any action on this. And my viewing of their action is saying, we're embarrassed by you, we're stepping aside. And what is another way of saying you're embarrassed by a fellow senator is saying that they're not upholding the legal and integrity, or the integrity and moral obligations of a senator,
Correct.
thus violating Senate ethics. It's mind-boggling here. I think tying back to the beginning of our conversation, Senator Bobby Joe Champion did them no good in him going so far in this. I think that he could have taken a step back. Two things we did not mention. Senator Kanesh, was she there still? Because I did not hear a single question from her in this. It was very minimal until the motions at the end.
Yes, she was active in the first ethics hearing, but not as much in the second. And you had sent me a message on that, and I'm like, oh, that's right, she's there, because it was quite interesting.
Even if it was just to tamp down what Champion was doing and asking some generic fact-finding questions, it was surprising to me that we didn't hear anything from her.
Oh, wait a second. I see what you're saying. You're saying that she just didn't show. Yeah, I get what you're saying. No,
right.
I
like,
missed
just
that.
wasn't doing doing anything.
I had not thought, from your standpoint, she didn't actively assert an oversight role, and she didn't actively participate.
She's 25% of this committee.
Correct.
She should have somewhere between 12 and 25% of the questions.
I was told there'd be no math. But yes, you're spot on about that. Yeah, I see the point you're making. Your point is even better now.
It just feels like that's how lopsided it was. And then the last thing I want to comment is watching the hearing. And now it was during bedtime, and so I was listening to a lot and watching a chunk of it. But based on what I saw myself and saw on Twitter, we did not see Senator Mitchell on camera.
Oh, yes.
If you've watched any committee hearing, usually there's not a wide view, but usually you get the testifier table, not the testifier. You get some zoomed in, but usually you can see the testifier table, some of the crowd behind them. We saw just the attorney, and we don't know motives and we don't know facts of the matter. But that was a directive, right? It seems very clearly that they were directed that they didn't want Republicans or outside groups to be able to have a photo of Senator Mitchell sitting next to a defense attorney in an ethics committee hearing, being able to be plastered on mail pieces.
Correct. The visuals were astounding. And I will note, someone had sent me a note on that, and then I noticed it, and I'm like, I couldn't stop seeing it then. And the longer it went on, and then it was very noticeable.
Mm-hmm.
So just to explain again, I don't know who, I think it's Senate Media Services that had the cameras. So the picture was very tight. You did not see, for an ethics committee hearing that lasted a couple hours on Senator Mitchell, she rarely appeared in like even a pan shot on TV. I was listening to it. I was at a ball game when it was going on. I was listening to it and watching a little in between innings. But I went home late last night, and watched it again, and it was even more noticeable then. And I would say, as someone who was a member of the AV club in high school, that's really a misuse of AV equipment. There should be some ethics about AV equipment and how they're used. There should have been a pan shot, but it was too obvious to not be orchestrated.
And I don't know the rules around how it works at the Senate. I know in Congress, the majority parties are the ones that give the directive to C-SPAN of typically how they handle things. Newt Gingrich was a big pioneer in this.
God, you are a nerd.
Yeah, he was the one who does the zoomed in shots so a member can sit up there and pontificate, and it's an empty room, but you would never know. So
Correct.
You get the videos. It's great. And so I have to assume, again, it's a directive. We don't know. It's too pointed to not be something going on in the backgrounds there.
And so if you were to take all these scenarios that we described, all of the little points that we raised, how do they all balance out? They all go one way. Statistically, if these were just random circumstances, you would think that one of these or two of these would break the Republicans' way. So logically, it just makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not much of a conspiracy theorist. I think we landed on the moon. But it's very clear that the Senate Democrats had that incredibly orchestrated last night. And to your point about Kunish, the other senator that was there not being engaged, coupled with Champion's aggressive approach just out of the gate going after Housley, and then the visual framing of it, they pulled, it's pretty clear to me that there was a lot of orchestration that was going on related to the charge.
Yep.
I also want to discuss this in one way that I haven't before as we close out this topic. I am mostly known as a political opposition researcher in a past life. One of the things that most people don't know about me is some may know that I wrote a true crime book. So I've read a lot of police reports. I have an extensive library at home of a lot of crime cases, crime books, true crime books. I have to say to you that at some point I may delve into just what the scenarios that I think were going on and what was actually going on. It is very difficult for me to come to the conclusion just based on, and again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a licensed investigator, but just as someone who's written written a book about a true crime case and follows this stuff closely, that I find it is simply defies logic that Senator Mitchell was dressed in black on the floor of her stepmother's bedroom or in the house in any way and have that be a good intention. And I would, at a later point, if this story develops and we hear more, we may discuss this from a true crime perspective, and you'll allow me to offer a number of scenarios and examples that I can give. There's just not a lot of examples of people dressed in black on the floor of someone's bedroom or breaking into a house where it ends up in a good way and a crime's not being committed.
Right.
And again, to the point that you raised at the beginning of this subject, which was raised by Senator Housley, obviously the Senate Democrats had concerns. Obviously, the Senate Democrats had concerns because the first disciplinary action that she encountered for being involved and being charged was by the Senate Democrats. And it's so inconsistent, I think, of the Senate Democrats to then slow down any progression on a path that they've taken.
I have two things, and I don't mean to completely circle back, but I have to because you just brought this up. I saw a tweet by Representative Walter Hudson last night, and I want to read that real quick. This relates to some line of questioning that Senator Miller was putting out, and Senator Champion, again, coming to the defense of Senator Mitchell, countering. This is Representative Walter Hudson's tweet. Champion is now arguing that it might not have been Mitchell in the bedroom because the victim initially described the burglar as he. The implication is that someone else may have burglarized the home, and Mitchell was coincidentally hanging in the basement wearing dark clothes during an announced 4:30 a.m. welfare check with a bunch of small stolen property. This is the most embarrassing performance imaginable, and you could not write this.
I totally missed that tweet by Representative Hudson. I think we have to have that be the tweet of the week because we're going to reintroduce that segment.
Yeah.
I miss it. That's fantastic. He's exactly right.
He's exactly right. Champion was trying to discredit use of the 911 transcript that this woman or that there was somebody that burglarized the home that just so happened, according to the arrest of Senator Mitchell, to be Senator Mitchell. But he's saying, whoa, this victim clearly didn't know. It clearly could have been somebody else because they kept saying he. Well, she stepped on a person in her room at 4:30 a.m. who fled to the basement. It's just bonkers. But I really appreciated that tweet because it just really hit on the incredulousness of this chaos. But I want to ask one question before we move on about a little bit, and I'm putting you in a spot, so I apologize if you don't know the answer to this. Some question came up about the body cam footage and the release of that. In your history of some data finding and your writing of the book, who does get to release that? Because when asked about this, the defense attorney, in one of his many comments, said basically disregarding Senator Mitchell's rights, and I'm not going to let her say this, or she doesn't get to, I get to make the rules, all of this said. She doesn't get she doesn't have any say in this. I get to say if I'm going to do this, and basically under discovery right now, we're not releasing body cam.
A couple of things. There is a role for the law enforcement to do so, to quell kind of misinformation, maybe a civil unrest. If there's allegations related to mistreatment by that law enforcement acted in an inappropriate way, there is discretion by the law enforcement
Like
agents,
in the Floyd murder.
Yes, to release the body cam footage so it can be shown to the public to give a true, accurate portrayal of what occurred. Senator Mitchell could, I do believe if she is the only I do believe that she would have the right to do so as herself. She could say that she could say, I want my colleagues in the Senate to see what occurred, and I'm authorizing the release of the body camera footage. I think that there would be an effort if there were other parties on the camera footage. I think there would be attempts to blur them out,
Mhm.
but I think and this is the confusing little point that they're in. Her attorney shut that down right away. Now, Senator Mitchell is both a state senator and she's also a lawyer. She's also an individual who's been charged with a crime. Then the confusion that her attorney was creating, I believe, was he would not allow her to do that because her criminal proceeding in his head trumps anything that the Senate does at this point. And so, yes, Senator Mitchell could and has the authority to ask for and grant the release of the body camera footage from what occurred at that residence, and it would be properly released. Her attorney made it very clear that he would not allow that to happen. And that was a great point that you brought up because that's where it got to a point in the hearing where I think her defense of herself conflicted in
Mm.
such a great way with her role as a senator that I don't think the two are compatible. And just from my standpoint, to close this topic out, what I think the situation that the Senate has right now is because of the timing of the ethics hearing, we can get to a situation where a member near the end of session could be involved in something like this, and they'd be allowed to vote for partisan reasons to process bills and legislation, and it can later come out that there's more information could come out on the case. And I think it's an administrative conundrum that the Senate Democrats have created. It's unfortunate, and I think that Minnesotans deserve better. Let me also say, as I said in a media interview about this last week, a Republican does anything like this or is charge limiting, I'll be the first to say it needs to be examined. It needs to be looked at and they need to go. I have been consistent, particularly on matters related to drinking and driving, which impacts the legislature greatly. I, as listeners know, pleaded guilty to drinking and driving in 2013. I've been a passionate advocate for safe roads. I volunteer. I have spoken out immensely about legislators misusing or acting inappropriately driving drunk. They are allowed their due process, but there's opportunities for them to accept accountability and responsibility. They should be afforded that. But I certainly haven't been quiet on this, and I certainly won't be if a Republican acts this way. Honestly, I think my record is probably more consistent of speaking out on Republicans doing this stuff
Mhm.
than it has been Democrats. But in this particular situation, I think the right decision and the right proper decision was lost to partisanship last
Right.
night, and that's unfortunate.
And the last thing I will say, and then I want to move on, is I guess I do have to give some credit to Senator Mitchell. To sit through what she sat through at the Senate floor when she returned to voting and the press questions and sit through this hearing is not something I could do. If this was me, wrap it up. Peace out. I'm resigning. I'm getting out of here, going back to my home and not to be heard from again. I think it's wild to think that somebody has the capacity to withstand this sort of thing. And I think that is largely due to the DFL pushing her because they need her so badly. We chatted briefly, but I want to get into it a little bit more. Trump is coming to Minnesota. So he is coming. He's going to be keynote speaker at the upcoming Republican Party of Minnesota's Lincoln Reagan dinner. Quick nod to when I worked at the party, our last speaker in 2019 while I was there was Liz Cheney. So a little ironic with the
That's fantastic. That's a
Cheney.
great little piece of intrigue.
I try, but wanted to just chat briefly about what this means for Minnesota. So obviously in 2020, Trump had a huge ground game here. 2016 lost by just 1.5%. 2020, he did, despite his big ground game and efforts here, did lose by 7% in this state. But polls are showing it looking pretty close here in the state of Minnesota. And the Trump campaign has added Minnesota and Virginia to their kind of top 8 battleground states that they are hoping to win in 2024.
This was a very surprising development. I was very surprised, and I just retweeted and said wowza, because there's a number of reasons why this is significant. First of all, Biden's campaign is making a substantive effort here in Minnesota. And let's set the table here. Republicans have not won. The Republicans have won the race for president in Minnesota since 1972. It's the longest streak of any states in the union. So Minnesota is far behind. So, every couple of presidential cycles, at least since I've been active, there's been this kind of belief that could be close. And so it's the best way to cut through the noise is to say, are candidates coming? Are there investments being put on the ground? Because campaigns aren't going to spend resources and send their principals, whether it's the president or the former president, to these states if they're not an actual target state. And I think any fair analysis and record shows that the Biden campaign is investing in Minnesota. He's been here multiple times. The first lady's been here multiple times. Vice President Kamala Harris was here recently, and the fact that Donald Trump is coming here for the Lincoln Reagan dinner, I think is incredibly significant. The fact that the party was able to orchestrate that and get that done and get that type of investment shows that Minnesota Republicans are amping up for a very interesting presidential race that's going to happen here. And I was very surprised, but the only other way I can say it is just wowza, because it's such a fascinating development. I can't think of anyone better for, and again, I've said much in this episode that I didn't support Trump in 16 or 20, didn't vote for him this year, blah, blah, blah. I've said that all the time before, but my analysis stays the same. If you're a Minnesota Republican and you're a supporter of the president and that kind of MAGA movement, this is your leader. This is who you're going to have come to this state. And I think it's going to energize Minnesota Republicans. I think it's going to be great for the state party operation in terms of energizing them. I also think it's going to energize Minnesota Democrats, but it should put to bed, I think, until additional polling comes out, that Minnesota is clearly a targeted state.
The Trump campaign did put out internal polls, which take them for what they're worth, always a little kind of leaning. But internal polls have Trump and Biden at 40-40. When you take JFK Jr. out of it, Trump is up 5. When you take everybody besides Trump and Biden out, Trump is still up 3, obviously within margin of error there, but is telling. And one of the things I think a lot of people don't always consider, oh, sure, it's early in the season, he's taking a stop here. Wheels down here means it's not wheels down that day somewhere else. And so every stop is very strategic of what it brings to the battleground state. And so anytime they do come to Minnesota, it is because they need to move that needle or are working to move that needle. And I think you're spot on. I think it really is going to be energizing for the Republican MAGA base, who right now might feel a little complacent, might feel a little down out and kicked out and really beaten down from the 2 years of the trifecta and single party. Minnesota's going to turn red for the first time in 30, 40 years. No, I find it really tough. I'm not there yet. But it is really interesting. I did not expect that Trump was going to come back here. In fact, in 2020, he famously in Duluth said, if I lose Minnesota, I'm not coming back here ever. So he's already surprised. He's changed his tune on that. But we'll see. And this it's a big fundraising opportunity for the party. This is going to be a really good opportunity for them to bring in a lot of funds that they need to be able to build that party or that grassroots apparatus. And wow, we'll see.
I'm struggling to come up with, not to be Debbie Downer, but I'm struggling to come up with what's the downside for the party. And there really isn't. This is the front runner, the presumptive nominee. He's the de facto head of the party. He's the de facto nominee for president. Him coming here, as you articulated very well, wheels down. He's not somewhere else. He's investing in Minnesota. I think it shows a good relationship between the Trump campaign and the state party. I think it's good for the state party in terms of filling their coffers in operation. But I think you're also spot on in saying, if for the MAGA crowd here, which I don't identify with, but I can certainly recognize that they exist, this is going to be a very energizing moment. And I think also for the Democrats, I think it's going to be interesting to watch how much play is in Minnesota. I think there's going to be some aggressive polling, and I think it's going to be Minnesota. Just any fair analysis will say that if there's 2 presidential campaigns that are investing in this state based on even the reasonable polling, which you were right to characterize as internal, shows that Minnesota is being targeted in some way by both campaigns. And for Minnesota Republicans, that should be incredibly energizing right now. And it's something that be very interesting to watch how it plays out. Will you be attending the event and looking for an opportunity to meet the former president?
I will not. I have had the pleasure and opportunity to be at a number of events he has spoken at. And nope, not really my scene these days or my cup of tea, but more power to anybody who wants to go. Obviously, go donate to the Republican Party of Minnesota. I do support that. And the ripple effect that will come from this, the news media and all of that for Republicans, hopefully is I want to have optimism that the former president is going to align with his messaging
Yes.
of what Republicans down ballot need. But we'll see. We'll certainly chat about it. So he's here May 17th.
I will say just one kind of future episode options discussions. I remember I've been in with particularly with John Rouleau, who he's done analysis. John, I think, and I'm going to link to some of those back episodes. One of the questions I've asked him on a few episodes when he was offering analysis, and John is incredibly knowledgeable about national politics, and particularly in Minnesota with his work with the Minnesota Jobs Coalition and just understanding the layout. John has, I think, been a good resource to help me answer when I've asked the question, does Trump help or hurt in Minnesota? And John's analysis on that was good. I do think it would be good, an interesting show to bring in some Republicans who are just really passionate about the Trump campaign and talk about how his arrival, his coming here, whether we do that before or after, how that can impact the race. Because one of the discussions I always want to learn is, as we've discussed on topics of abortion or just on campaigning, explain to me how this helps or hurts and what's your kind of discussion. And I think with Republicans being so energized by a visit that I was surprised by, I think it'd be a great opportunity to invite some of those Republicans in who are purely identified as Republicans who overwhelmingly support Donald Trump and his candidacy. I think it'd be a really fascinating conversation.
Absolutely agree.
One of the Donald Trump discussions should lead into our next subject.
Yes.
I don't know. I don't know if I'm being fair. Is that fair of me to connect this in any way to the former president?
Sure. I'll make the tie.
Make the tie.
We're slowly getting down on the short list of potential vice president nominees.
There you go.
One name that has been on that list that likely is no more is Governor Kristi Noem. So being off for a week, we didn't have the chance to wade into this. And so let's do it. We are going to chat about Governor Kristi Noem and break down all of the controversy surrounding the blurb in her now much anticipated book release, where she discussed that she brought her 14-month-old wire-haired pointer named Cricket to a gravel pit and shot him to death.
This far away, it literally just sucked the air out of the room.
It really does. There's dogs and babies are like an automatic gain half a point in the polls, right? And so when killing a 14-month-old dog, regardless of if you're explaining, you're losing. We've talked about that time and time again. So I want to chat a little bit about the issue itself, but also the PR comms component of this. Starting out with, wow, this is her second book. Her last book 2 years ago, she tried to include this story. The team around her at the time had the wherewithal to pull that. So that was not in the story the last time around. Somehow this got through. It's in her story. It's been out there. And what's your initial take on this story coming out? And then let's get into the subsequent media circus following it.
I am struggling even to this moment to come up with a strategy by which this makes sense for her to release. She describes shooting a puppy, a dog with a name, Cricket.
A puppy. 14 months old.
And the fact that this did not come out in a deposition behind closed doors. This was a voluntary statement that she made. I cannot begin to understand what she was thinking. And I have some concerns about what she was thinking, but I just have to tell you, I cannot comprehend why she would think that there was an upside to this. And it haunts me to think that she thinks there was an upside to this. The most disturbing aspect of this is that and she's no different than any politician, that they're very strategic about what they portray, what they show. And this was the decision to show this. This was something that she advocated for, as you pointed out in her first book, which was not done. But in her second book, she was insistent on including. And this is just monstrous. And I do not see I can't begin to comprehend what she thought she was thinking, number one, by doing this. Number two, by advocating for it in the first book and then getting it in the second book and then advocating for it and trying to portray that it's some type of plus or some type of positive that you murdered a puppy.
I've always been taught that whenever you do anything, the goal of an elected or a candidate is to get press, votes, or money.
I noticed that murdering dogs was not on that list.
It was not.
Okay.
Press was. So she certainly has gotten press on this. What is she has gone on a complete press junket, right? She has been on Meet the Press. She has been all over the board trying to explain, which again, I understand that a lot of times as individuals, elected officials believe that she truly believes that she did not do something wrong, that this dog did have a background of attacking some livestock, being vicious towards children. That may be true. It still is just so across the board bonkers to say. I want to read through some of the reasoning she laid out or excuses of why this is. Again, very much highlighting that she does not believe it's in the wrong and this is why she shared it. But then let's chat about the actual media circus. So she said she wanted to include this story because it showed a decisive person who was unwilling to be bound by namby-bamby niceties. She, quote, said, what the point of the story is that most politicians, they run from the truth. They will shy away and hide from making tough decisions. I don't do either of those. She said she had to choose between keeping my small children and other people safe or a dangerous animal, and I chose the safety of my children. The governor, sticking to her political brand, didn't go back. She described the killing as a kind of tough decision that you have to make on a farm and contrasted her decisiveness with Joe Biden's failure to act after his own chronically ill-behaved German Shepherd attacked Secret Service, which she has made jokes now that he needs to go meet Cricket, aka believes that he should be shot.
Jeez.
And she has defended her decision by saying, South Dakota law states that dogs who attack and kill livestock can be put down. Now, that might all be true. But again,
Yes.
you're explaining you're losing. Oh, South Dakota law says I can shoot my dog in the head, so I shot my dog in the head.
Yes. We should have been videotaping right there because your impression of Kristi Noem was just spot on.
And it's so sad to me. I really do actually think Kristi Noem has been a good messenger. She's a little further right than I believe, or that I personally am. But I do believe that she has been a good advocate for the Republican message, for strong, independent Republican women. And it just is. So not only did she do this, she put this out, but then she went on all of the interviews.
Let me give a piece of advice that I think is not all press is good press.
Yeah.
And I take that to heart myself. Not all press is good press. There is a belief out there that anytime the press is talking about you, it's not good. Trust me, I know that.
Yeah.
And so the fact that there's a belief that she would willingly participate in this story, that she would put it out there. I cannot begin to tell you how moronic. And what concerns me, if I may, is that what concerns me about this is that this was a calculated decision that she made to put this out. Again, this wasn't in a deposition. This wasn't a part of some data request. She paid to put this in a book. She voiced the audio for this. I believe that she did that because she believed that story of her murdering a puppy would endear her in some way inside this. It would elevate her up, that she would be tough. And I can't for the life of me reconcile how she could think that was a rational thought. Obviously, she's a former member of Congress. She's the governor of South Dakota. You don't get to those types of positions by being politically feeble.
Right.
But I understand that type of tough swagger, that she wants to portray, but she murdered a dog.
Yeah.
And I can't for the life of me look past that. I can't for the life of me look past it. It just doesn't, I have probably never struggled more, because one of the things we're supposed to do when we talk about these subjects, and this is what I wanted to talk about, I can't come up with a good answer.
Right.
I can't break this down other than she shot a dog in a gravel pit.
100% agree. And to me, a couple things, it feels as though, based on that plethora of excuses and reasoning that she has given throughout all of these interviews, feels to me as though they were not expecting this reaction. Because if they were expecting this reaction, you have one response, right? Every time you're asked about it, you say, he was a danger to livestock and my children, and I did what I had to do. And you repeat that every single time. She's clearly trying to work all of these different angles here. And I feel like it was really, they thought they were going to gloss over this. I don't think that for some reason, I think they did not expect it to be that big of an issue. And do you not have a better story of showing how you make the tough decisions better than a Joe Biden or other Democrat? There's nothing else in your congressional or gubernatorial history that you can point to aside from shooting a dog of you being willing to make tough decisions?
I don't understand it. It just doesn't make any sense. And I also, it reminds me of how far the party has fallen.
Right.
In terms of Nixon and his famous Checker speech. Checker was the dog that he was not going to return, and related to the Checker speech or the fun speech about this kind of slush fund. Nixon went on TV and said, we're not giving Checkers back. We're not returning the dog. She would have shot Checkers, and she shot Cricket in a gravel pit. I cannot for the life of me understand it. And let me just say this to you. I don't have a ton of experience in farm life. My wife's family is from the state of Iowa, so I've spent a lot of time on the farm. I have no experience whatsoever in any way. It's always a place that is a danger to me because I'm the type of person that takes the combine out or gets wrapped up in some machinery and it's a problem. I will have to say to you that having been to the farm in Iowa multiple times, they've had animals down there. They just don't go shoot animals. They've had pets at the farm, and it's been a big deal when those pets can be either hit by a car or another, or they've been lost or they passed away in some way. I cannot identify with taking a dog to a gravel pit, which, by the way, is where a lot of true crime stories begin, is in gravel pits. And she named the dog and put it in the book. I can't, for the life of me, understand this.
And even more, like you, I didn't grow up on a farm. I understand that things happen on a farm that we would never want to see or hear about. So don't tell us.
Yes.
It's not fine that this happened. It happened. Don't tell us about it. Don't share it. Don't write it in your book. Leave that up to some Oppo research coming up and figuring it out. Really ridiculous. Last comment I have on this is that since this story came out, a bipartisan group of members of Congress did set up a Congressional Dog Lovers Caucus.
Fantastic.
A little jab there, and I think it's fantastic. And if I was in Congress, I would join that.
I look forward to that day. You'd be a member of Congress.
Yeah.
I bet you'd make sure my family got a good tour.
Yeah.
Can I ask just a couple things? How much time do you think was spent discussing the inclusion of this in the book?
Obviously not enough. And
do you think it was calculated decision, meaning it was like, do you think she sincerely believed that this is going to land really well?
I think she truly did. And it also goes to tell me about some of the people around her. My job working for members of Congress as communications director was to poke holes, to say, you say this, these are the arrows coming back at you. And so if her staff, if they did discuss it, they did not do a good enough job, because what constituency do you win in this? Who comes over and says, I'm a Democrat who hates dogs. I'm going to vote for Kristi Noem.
Yes.
Like, I just...
My goodness. We have to, and again, it's one of our goals to start recording these. Becky, that was fantastic. That's twice today.
I just don't say, I think there are a lot of times that stories are told in a way that not widely accepted or very popular do bring in a small constituency, right? They do bring somebody back to the table or open up something. I don't see that opportunity here, and that's where it is just really lost on me of how those surrounding her allowed this to move forward because of that. That's your job as staff, is to poke those holes and say you're going to lose X amount and you're going to not gain or gain, or to do those political, especially as somebody who has clearly been a rising star in the Republican Party. Does she get past this?
I don't think so. I think a couple things. I think I think you've articulated very well and laid it out this way. First of all, it's the decision, following your logic, it's the decision of including it in the book. Let me start over. It's the decision, first of all, of bringing little Cricket, 14th Merle Cricket, to a gravel pit and shooting him.
Yep.
Number one. Number two, it's the decision to write it in a book. Then it's number three, it's to message on it and try to dig yourself further in, and to think that's a smart strategy.
On Meet the Press.
Not only do we have the bad decision of murdering Cricket, but then it's to message on it multiple times. And that's where I think her standing has gone down, because the expectation is again, let's say it one more time. You're not murdering dogs, but if you are, you're murdering a puppy. But if you are, you're not going to message on it and then go on national TV and talk about it. Have a filter, have some common sense. Nixon in 52, when he went out and talked about checkers, that was a defining moment. And Nixon, who is a caricature to this day in politics, at least he had the common sense to go out there and say, we're not giving checkers back. She brought Cricket to the gravel pit and shot him, and she thinks her standing is going to go up. I hate to say this, Nixon was right in this particular instance in 52 when he did this. And so I cannot understand this, and I don't understand the logic. I think, again, I'll pose this question to you. Had it just come out that she had killed the dog and she had not messaged on it, do you still think she would have been picked?
No, I don't think so. I think that she was maybe in the bottom half of the list of top 10 prior to this, but I think this has certainly knocked her off.
Yes. And I think and rightfully, I cannot understand this. My biggest concern again is that this was, aside from the killing of the dog, that this was a calculated decision that a group of people said, this would be really good for you to talk about. And I don't understand it.
Yeah.
I had a dog growing up. My dog's name was Sandy. I miss it to this day. There's a bunch of neighborhood dogs that I just adore. And I cannot, to the life of me, relate to this at all.
I just left my dog for 5 days when I went to Florida, and I literally cried dropping him off at the daycare place. Like, it was just, yeah.
Oh, just so I ask, because we asked about dumpster diving. You've not shot any animals that you're aware of?
I have not.
Not. I will, in the interest of complete and total disclosure, note that I did go hunting with my father, never shot a deer, and at one point just took the bullets out and the ammunition out, and
Never hit a deer or never shot at a deer?
I never shot at a deer.
I thought maybe just were bad.
Never shot a deer, never fired the deer rifle. At one point, took the bullets out and said, this really isn't for me. And at one point, my dad caught me on my cell phone in the deer stand. And so it just wasn't, it's just not for me.
Same. It's been wild to watch unfold. I would like to think that hopefully her media tour on this is done. I don't know where she goes from here because the book hasn't even been released yet. So the book is now to be released, I believe, either later this week or early next week. This was just a preview that came out. She's mad that everybody's focusing on this one little story. I'm sure we will come back to some other revelations that came out, like her fake meeting with North Korea dictator.
Yes.
That did not happen. So more to come. Wow. We love dogs.
We love dogs. Probably one of the largest unforced error I've seen a candidate make.
Agreed.
Yep. Thank you so much for doing this. I missed doing this last week. This is a longer episode, but we covered a lot of topics, and fantastic work today.
Good to be here.
We'll be back next week.
Bye.
We want to thank you for listening to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Before we go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on the platform where you listen. You can leave a review or give us a shout out on our website or across all social media platforms at BBBreakPod. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will return next week. Thank you again for listening.